and welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. I'm your host, Erik Fisher, and this episode has been a long one in the making. I am finally talking with Tamsen Webster. We had to reschedule this one a few different times, but you don't need to know that, but I just thought I'd share. In this conversation, we are talking about her latest book, Say What They Can't Unhear, the 9 Principles of Lasting Change. But we also incorporate and talk about her previous book, Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible. And so between those two books, we talk about change and communication, persuasion. We talk about why belief comes before behavior. Tamsen explains that people don't act on your idea until it aligns with who they believe they are. We also talk about the red thread framework. It's a practical way to structure your message and messaging, the role that story plays without telling stories, how you can build a narrative logic even if you're not telling anecdotes. And we also talk about the number one reason that ideas fall flat and messages don't stick. So no matter what role you're in, you're communicating, and that's exactly where this episode is going. We're talking about connecting what you're saying with what people are already thinking and helping your ideas resonate, stick, and create change that lasts. Well, it is my privilege to welcome to the show Tamsen Webster. Tamsen, welcome to Beyond the To-Do List.
I am delighted to be here. I live and die by my to-do list so that I can get beyond it. So this is going to work out.
Well, let's rewind a little bit because we didn't get to chat when Red Thread, your previous book, launched. And I've been wanting to ask where that concept came from originally, and also kind of go from there into this expanded psychology of change and what you're talking about in the new book, Say What They Can't Unhear, the 9 Principles of Lasting Change.
Yes. Well, I'm delighted to talk about that. So I would say in certain ways that's all connected. One could say by a red thread. And let's start first by what that means. So it is a red thread it's an idiom, kind of an expression that is more common in Northern European countries to refer to kind of the thing that holds everything together, the logical progression of ideas, the big idea, the gist, the essence, like what's the point? And so when I first heard it, I was like, I just love the kind of visual metaphor of this kind of like visible through line, even, metaphorically visible through whatever somebody's talking about, because you certainly feel when something doesn't have it, right?
Oh yeah.
And you may not even realize that something does, and that's why it's powerful. But I was really intrigued by that concept because in the work that I do, as in message design and on all its various formats and all the places it shows up, that is so key to a message's success, is the ability for other people to very clearly understand and be interested in, and ultimately to agree and align with what that red thread is. So I had cool concept. At the same time, I was like, well, how do we create that? What is that? And one of the things that I've spent really my career trying to figure out, and I'm not even kidding about this, is 25 years, same question. How is it that we create sustainable changes in thinking and behavior? I mean, I've been interested in it since I had my first panic attack when I was 17. I was interested in it even after I had my last one at 34. But whether it was my kind of moonlighting jobs or it was my day job, that really, in marketing, branding, et cetera, that's what it's all about. The red thread as a process for finding one's red thread came because one of the best ways that I've found through kind of just working with people over and over and over again, all these years doing it, is that the more that we can externalize how we think about an idea, not necessarily even what we think, that'll come out, but how we think about an idea, the clearer it is to people. And, 8-9 years ago, when I first started working on the red thread, I started with this hypothesis really that said, what is kind of a universal mental model for understanding? And it's not hard to look around and say, that's story structure. And I found some amazing research that said that any information presented, even just in the structure of a story, is perceived and understood by the brain more easily, with less loss, with less friction, and therefore with oftentimes more trust. So I was like, okay. And so what I did with the red thread was I tried to, based on all the research I was doing, tried to come up with the 5 universal elements of any story. So not just hero's journey, that's a good one, but it doesn't always apply.
Yeah.
So those 5 elements of any journey, so that we could work with folks to deconstruct their ideas, put it into that structure, and make it more understandable and ideally agreeable to everyone else.
I love it. And, being somebody who I was a communications major, I've said this many times on this show, the comm theory was always the shining star of all the courses I took. That and symbols and imaging, seeing some of those things, and man, studying the swastika, that was a big deal.
Yeah,
but anyway, we won't go into that. Yes. But comp it's right up my alley with that.
I'm so excited. And it's not unrelated, because I'm actually really, really interested in kind of the history of rhetoric and the movement that's known as the New Rhetoric, which happened in the 50s, right after World War II, because we were trying to figure out how can we arm the populace to kind of defend themselves against speech making and messaging like that from Hitler and Mussolini that was authoritarian, which led people away from justice, led people away from their own individual rights and freedoms. Like, what happened there? So we are going to have fun, Erik, because I love theory. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And to pull this into a practical, somebody's listening to this and they're like, okay, I get it. I have lots of ideas for me. And again, you have clients. They didn't have any issue with coming up with ideas. It was more their red thread, their big idea, their main idea, and articulating that their audience would understand / receive it, let alone be moved by it.
Yeah. And a lot of it comes down to how do you make it make sense to somebody else, right? Because the thing is, once you've come up with an idea, you think it's the right idea because it makes sense to you. And the challenge that a lot of us get into, and I talk about this in the first book, is that we focus so much on what we want to say about an idea that we forget what other people need to hear, not just to agree with it, but to even make sense of it. And that is one of the key things. And what's so interesting as I continue to do this work and this research is how much we are not taught as practitioners, as students, as whatever, about what's actually necessary for someone to understand not just the words that are coming out of your mouth, but the meaning of those words and your intended meaning behind those words. And so this is just a thing that I'm endlessly fascinated by, because so often, I think we see this really day to day.
Yeah. Things
that seem to make perfect sense to us make no sense to somebody else, or flip that script. And we're like, I have no idea how whatever you are doing makes sense to you. You must be insert insult here. But humans aren't wired that way. Humans aren't wired in any way to operate outside of internal alignment, outside of internal logic. So if somebody is acting in a way that you don't understand, what you're not understanding is not just their actions, you're not understanding the way they think about things. You can't do anything where communication is involved without understanding some of these basic principles of how people make sense of information, how they decide what does and doesn't feel right to them, and what's necessary to avoid to make sure that you're not actually poisoning that well of change before you ever even get started. So it's just, I literally cannot think of anything more practical, because it's such a persistent problem. Again, over the centuries, and I'm not even kidding about that, the whole rise of logic and rhetoric in the first place goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. Why? It was in response to the fact that Athens got themselves talked into attacking another country they were not prepared to do, and it absolutely destroyed them. So yeah, I think it is highly relevant always.
I think one of the key components that I noticed as I was going through this was how powerful belief and especially identity. Can you talk a little bit about identity? I mean, it clicked that it was suddenly like, oh, so when I'm saying something that doesn't jive with somebody else, it's not necessarily that they don't agree with the thing. It's more that it doesn't agree with who they say they are or who they've made themselves up to be, their identity.
Correct. Absolutely. And so that's actually the kind of little friction point curiosity that led me to my second book, which is you can have a beautifully architected story. You can have a beautifully architected piece of communication, speech, pitch deck, whatever. It can check all the boxes that everybody says you should have, and people will understand it. And then they still won't agree with it. And I was like, why? Like, what is going on here? Because if story is the end all be all, and it does seem like everybody tries to tell us it is, what is going wrong there? Like, what are we missing? And I think there's a couple things going on. Number one is exactly what you just talked about. I got like what sent me down this very rich rabbit hole, by the way, was this old maxim about storytelling that a story is an argument. And I said to myself, what if that is true? And I couldn't help but notice that the same guy was responsible for like our kind of uber meta understanding of story, Aristotle, 3-act structure, setup, conflict, resolution. And who was responsible for kind of understanding like argument, logic, how people make decisions, coming up with models for that? Again, centuries ago, millennia ago. So what I decided was, all right, let's explore a very similar idea. Let's make this mental model of decision-making, make a mental model of agreement explicit, where story is a mental model of understanding made explicit. The idea of an argument is how we decide, how we make sense of something to agree with it. So I was like, well, what happens there? What kinds of things have to be kind of supporting that argument in order for someone to get there? And it isn't what we were taught. It isn't in the first place, the data, the evidence, et cetera. Not that those things aren't necessary, they are, but they aren't what gets processed first. So one of the things that I've always been really interested in is this kind of interplay between our primal, intuitive, instinctive brains. Sometimes people call that emotional. It's part of that, but it's not just emotional. I think we do ourselves a disservice by just thinking it's like it's logic and emotion. And I'm like, no, it's rational and intuition and instinct and pattern recognition. What happens is that instinctive, primal, emotional brain processes much more quickly than the slow, rational, critical thinking and analysis brain. And so think about what that means. It means that whenever you say anything, the first judgment is the snap judgment from the fast brain, right? It's does that feel right? Does that align with what I know to already be true? Does this person feel right? Do I trust them? Do I sense that what they're saying is good for me? Are they good for me? Are they on my side? Are they with me? Are they against me? And whatever gut check like happens, whatever the conclusion of that gut check, instantaneous, before you're even aware of it, determines entirely or almost entirely how that slow critical brain processes anything else you have to say. So that second book really started from this idea of, oh, I get it. We need the logic because both brains love logic and particularly causality. If this happens, or if I want this, then I need to do that. Or this happened because this happened, or this will happen if I want this and do this, this will happen, right? That's what the fast brain is trained on. And the logic brain, like the rational brain, needs it to kind of validate and rationalize to itself, right? Like this made sense. But the only kind of evidence that's fast enough for the fast brain is belief. So if I don't kind of give you the whole picture, let me put it that way. If I'm pressed for time and I don't give you the whole picture where I say, okay, we're trying to get people kind of to genuinely believe in a new idea. We're trying to get buy-in for something. We're trying to get them all on the same page. Well, two things are true. Number one, every decision we make has a story behind it. Another way to say it is every action ends an internal argument about why that action makes sense. And then the second principle, the arguments we agree with, particularly quickly and instinctively, are based on beliefs we already have. So that's why if we want to build buy-in, we need to build an argument based on what people already believe. And people get it. And it's like, again, I didn't give you any evidence. There's a ton, by the way. But any evidence other than your own experience, your own understanding of the world, your own intuition. Now, if I've got more than 30 seconds, then yes, I can do all sorts of things like wrap it in a story. I can give you all that data, that evidence, the step-by-step and all that you need to really understand kind of it in actuality in order to be able to do it. But like that second book is all about how do we create the conditions to maximize the agreement from the get-go? Because if we don't have the elements for agreement, then we're never going to get the understanding that we really need. And we're certainly not going to get all the other stuff. Like we could be investing so much time in the wrong stuff because we're trying to make beautiful or copywritten or, graphically brand designed something that your ideal audience goes, I don't get it.
Yeah. The fact base.
Or I do get it and I don't agree. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so basically you're saying that the belief-based or belief-driven decisions are going to be more enduring than fact-based persuasion.
Absolutely.
But
yes.
You still need those facts because
you do. Yes.
Then that other brain, the second brain, the rational brain, the logic brain kicks in and then uses what was delivered eloquently and succinctly and intelligently to bolster the emotional or belief-driven, first gut decision, so to speak. Precisely.
You still have to be able to defend it and support it 100%. But what I am talking about is if something doesn't, so first of all, something's got to make sense. That's where story structure can come in. But something has to make sense to me, given what you're talking about before, given how I see myself and given how I see how the world works. So if you're trying to convince me that something, I didn't even understand what you're saying and I don't understand why it would work, it kind of doesn't matter, right? So if I don't understand, again, the rationale behind it, and not the data and evidence part, but the rationale, then I can't tell myself that it makes sense. And I certainly can't tell other people. And I've always been intrigued by the red thread. I say in the first line of the book, that the book could have been one line, that the best way to make your ideas irresistible is to build the story people will tell themselves about it. I've kind of been floating on this idea for 9 years now, because in order for someone to be able to tell themselves a story about why this makes sense, it has to align with all of those things. The good news is when you can do that, if it's done well, you're actually arming that person with the same language they need to tell that story by themselves to other people as well. And that happens all the time, right? When someone's like, why are you doing X? Or if you're at a company, right? And they're like, well, why are you saying we should hire this person? And I mean, think about that situation. I do a lot of work with B2B companies. How often, your B2B salesperson comes in with this 78-page deck of all of these details. And, and someone eventually figures out, your internal advocate eventually figures out that this is what they want to do. And how are they supposed to make that case to somebody else? They can't. So, I mean, I think the way that I love to summarize this is to paraphrase the psychologist Leon Festinger. And I think I quoted him in probably both books because he's been so formative to my thinking. And again, the paraphrase is that we are not rational decision makers. We're rationalizing decision makers. the important thing here, though, is that we are still logical decision makers. Logic meaning it is in our minds, we are operating based on logically sound arguments, logically valid arguments that may only be kind of true for us. I think what happens is sometimes we get this confusion, right? Where we're like, well, it's either logical or emotional. I'm like, no, it's always logical. But what we need first is belief-based logic, because that's what's going to support that initial rationalizing. Gut check. Yep. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I can see why that would work. And then we need to put the rational evidence, data, and even the emotional, intuitive storytelling around it so that someone goes, and now not only do I know this is right with my critical thinking brain, but I can now feel that it's right or tell another story that shows that it's right. And that, from all the work that I've done both in the field and now increasingly with my research, because I started a doctoral program last summer. Why not? that 1-2 punch, I don't really like to be violent about it. That's really critical. It is astonishingly overlooked how important that establishing and making explicit the rationale is behind a decision, not just the reasons, not just the evidence, not the data, not the if then, not the big Simon Sinekian why. All of that is part of it. But ultimately, it's that internal argument that's going to produce that decision, right? That we have to have in order to be able to transfer the idea to somebody else. And this is what, all of my work is based on: establishing genuine belief in that idea, not coercion, manipulation, persuasion. Let me use these psychological tricks to kind of use your own brain against you. Be fully transparent about my rationale and the beliefs it's based on for me, so that you can hear my rationale and decide whether or not it aligns for you.
Yeah. And
then we can move forward.
I can't help but think of somebody that I've seen, very public person, not going to name who really exemplifies this when they go on podcasts or news outlets and talks in places you wouldn't expect to see this person talking. And that should be enough clues for everybody right now, I think, that would be tuned in. But what they do is they don't talk down to anybody. They are appealing to that emotional gut thing first. And again, they're not speaking so eloquent that they're above everyone else. It's that I'm here sitting with you and we are just talking. And that's right. I am you and you are me, not that we're John Lennon lyrics, but that we are relating. We are both humans trying. We all want this and this and this. And you get them agreeing to the where they realize, oh, my identity isn't necessarily very different from yours. We all very commonly, macro level, want the same things. And then moves into some of, but not slam a gavel down, evidence as to, well, if we want all that, then we've got to go this route. No, but by speaking that way, I've seen that person get more agreement from people you would never see that happen with, play out in a public sphere.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, that's it. I mean, I'm all about paraphrasing today, apparently, Eric. So, I mean, famously Seth Godin, termed permission marketing, almost 20 years ago now. And other than the fact that I don't like the word persuasion, because I still think it implies some level of coercion and manipulation, kind of not free and open choice. I really see this approach, just to kind of make it plain English for people, as permission persuasion, meaning I'm going to, by kind of establishing some of that common ground and by securing understanding and agreement kind of at every phase of the rationale building, I am securing for you permission to proceed with explaining more. And I think not only, whether you come at it from, hey, I want people to have free and open choice, I want people to be well informed by their decisions, whether that comes from an ethical standpoint or from an altruistic standpoint. I mean, frankly, it's supportable from an economic standpoint too, and an efficiency standpoint, because economically, The more that people genuinely believe and understand an idea and can make that case to themselves and others, the far less likely you are going to get customer churn, buyer's remorse, ghosting on somebody who says yes, but then doesn't actually play through. And from an efficiency standpoint, by putting all of this stuff up front and being fully transparent about it, you also are able to establish where are those points of disagreement really at the root. And we end up so often, and this is a point made by a fantastic book. I forget her first name repeatedly, but the last name is Reames, Reames, I believe. And the book is called The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself. It's actually kind of like the history of rhetoric for lay people. Trust me, it's fascinating. It really is. It's like really interesting. But what ends up happening is that when we are kind of fully transparent and when we're fully kind of putting all of this out there for other people, right, it ends up putting the risk of change back on us and not on the person that we're talking to, which is inherently much more trustworthy, right? And it's also inherently non-manipulative, right? Because you are legitimately putting your own rationale on the table for examination. But what it allows people, and this is why I was bringing in Reames's book, is that it allows us to get away from policy decisions and policy disagreements. And policy doesn't just necessarily mean politics. It's anytime you're arguing over tactics, anytime you're arguing over the means to an end. Oftentimes in that tension, these kind of means ends conflicts, as the scholarship would say, we forget that there's a word, back to Machiavelli, we forget that there's a word sitting between those two. And it's the justifies. The ends justifies the means. And what I'm seeing and what I'm so excited about with my doctoral research right now is, again, how overlooked and how powerful the justifies part is. And so the more that we can actually move back and say, okay, if we're just disagreeing about something, and if we are disagreeing about the best way to do something, it's sometimes we'll skip back to the Simon Sinekian why. Like, don't we all want blank? Yes. And then it still goes all to hell. Why? Because we need to say, why do you believe that particular approach is the best way to achieve that? Not just that you believe that it does, obviously you do, or you wouldn't be arguing for it, but what is the justification that you have for why that would work? And here's the kicker. Ask when they give you evidence, which they will, because it's very natural, to say, why do you believe that evidence supports that? What about that evidence justifies that? Because there is always a deeper belief. And this is one of the fun things I've been learning about as well. And that's that justification has an official name. It's called a warrant, just like, a search warrant, right? What is a search warrant? It is the justification that you've secured to allow allow a search, right? If there's a warrant out for your arrest, it's because someone was able to justify the fact that that action was necessary. I need to get to criminal things with that, but that's, you can tell I get very excited about this. But the justification piece, the more that we can talk about those kinds of beliefs, the sooner we can find those disagreements and then either find alternative common ground, which I believe there's a much broader band of common ground than we give ourselves as humans credit for. And that's not just being starry-eyed. I like to say I'm a starry-eyed realist. There actually literally is a huge band of stuff that most people agree with. You said something similar to yourself already. Yeah. The faster we can do that, the less we don't go so far down the pipeline of polarization, right? Of everyone digging into their positions. Because again, there's probably a lot more that we actually agree with if we were just to back up and say, hey, help me understand why, legitimately be curious about why you feel that's the best way. And the more that I can work to arm people and equip them with the questions to ask and the things to listen for and that awareness of there's always a deeper belief in play. And that and other people are always operating in a way that makes sense to them. So therefore, our job as humans interested in collective action and people working together on whatever it might be, even if it's just one other person, our primary understanding should be trying to figure out what does make sense to them and what would make sense to them and why would it make sense to them? Because that's the only way we're going to get everybody to understand it and ultimately genuinely believe in it.
And again, we talked so much earlier about feelings. And so tying that back into this, it's that your, let's say, for lack of a better term, your solution for them, I don't like the word argument, but your reasoning, for them to accept your reasoning, I guess is a better way to...
Rationale.
Yes,
yeah,
your
I'm
rationale.
using rationale lately. Yeah, because I think rationale is a less loaded term than argument.
For them to receive your rationale, you have to get past that gut check, that belief, let's call it filter. And for you to get through that belief filter of theirs, they need to feel like what you're saying to them isn't, as you put it in your book, a reprimand, but it's more like relief.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, so for future study is what is the, given the nature of the audience or the suspected nature of the audience that you're talking about. So in the introduction of the book, identify kind of say what they can on here, identify kind of 4 potential audience natures. Like whenever you're introducing something new or novel for the first time, you've got people who are going to be, the 2 you would totally expect. You've got people who are kind of, you can expect to be against it for whatever reason. And you've got people you could expect to be for it for whatever reason. And then there are people in the middle who, there's actually 2 groups in the middle, I staunchly believe, and I would say that the research seems to support. Number 1, there are the people who legitimately do not care. So I call those people indifferent. And maybe you can get them to care by anchoring a message in something that they care about or by invoking a belief that they have that's deeply held. But generally, they're not usually going to go against you, but they're just not going to be actively for you as well. So, be aware of them. The people I think that are the most important when it comes to kind of converting the tide, right, towards collective action or shared belief in a new direction or strategy, that is that group that I call ambivalent. And a lot of times we use the words ambivalent and indifferent interchangeably, but they're not. Indifferent, again, means they just don't care. They're literally like apathetic. I don't care. Ambivalent do care, but they care in conflict, meaning things that they care deeply about, like whether those are values or beliefs or their own self-interest or their own altruistic nature, are in direct conflict, and they are pulling kind of equally at each other and keeping them kind of in stasis. And those people are so important because A, they are already actively looking for information to help them reach closure. Like there's such strong psychological support for like how much of a drive state like closure is. Like, just let me make it make sense and like close it out of my head. We don't like sitting in this conflict dissonant place. And so people who are actively looking for information are really important to you. And they're looking for information that's going to tip them one way or the other, right? And there's plenty of people from kind of those for you and against you folks that are filling their ears with stuff. So this is where that idea of having a really strong rationale, like where the reasoning is clear, explicit, makes sense, transparent, based on things they already understand and already are familiar with, already agree to be true, makes it a lot easier for them to go, oh, yeah, either it makes sense and I agree, or you know what, it makes sense. I see why you think that's a good idea. This is ultimately more important to me. And my observation at this point, it's not just my belief, my observation is that even when that happens, it's a much more respectful disagreement. It's a much more, oh, I get it. This is actually more important to you right now. Fine. Now, I could attempt to convince you that this other thing that I think is more important, but then we are fundamentally denying the agency of the other person we're talking to. And we're coming across as, I know better. And if that's what you believe, then you are not actually trying to get genuine agreement and belief in this idea. You're trying to figure out what to say to get someone to do something. Mm-hmm. And they may, 100%, they may. But, as we've been talking about, my one-time action or even a couple-time action is not a high enough bar for me, for my work, for the clients that I work with. For me, it's sustainable action. It is permanent or near permanent shifts in perspective, transformational shifts in perspective, after which the world looks different. And therefore, the appropriate, valid, best fitting behavior is different. And nothing else after that makes sense. Like, that's the bar that I set. And you cannot manipulate somebody into that level of belief.
Yeah. Pain is often used.
You can. Let me say, you can. But yeah, I was going to say, because I was like, wait, cult leaders.
Is the key.
But even then, you can't. So can you get them into level of belief? Yes. Can you get it where it is a free and open choice, fully agentic choice? Like, no. Right. And that just comes down to belief. A lot of people in the kind of sales, communication, conversation space that use psychological tricks, behavioral mechanisms, that use techniques from psychology outside of licensed, psychologically safe environments in order to achieve their ends. There is no justification for that in my mind. Sometimes you have to be authoritarian in order to stop your child from running into the street, but you're not trying to get genuine belief in, like, don't get hit by a car. When you're trying to sell a widget, I personally would not be able to sleep well at night, knowing that I had essentially coerced someone into, by, using psychology, our own psychology against them without full and clear information so that I could sell my thing. Some people are fine with it. I'm not. I can still be friends with those people. I'm just not going to do it. And I'm not going to teach it, and I'm not going to support it. And I'm going to do everything I can to make a case for a different way to be and to operate.
I think there's a lot less impulse buying than there really is. I think it's more, the impulse buy is a momentary decision, but it's an actual long arch into the past of continual awareness and messaging, but then into the future. It's a moment that's arching into the future as well.
Oh, yes. And that's, as you say, the impulse is not an impulse. I mean, that's beautifully described, Erik, because that, when I do my kind of monthly free fundamentals of message design webinar, if I'm giving a keynote on this, I almost always start with 3 questions to people. Number 1 is, who's ever been to IKEA? Number 2, who's ever left IKEA with something you didn't plan to buy? And number 3, why? Right. And the thing is that in that moment, clearly, that's, by the way, it's 60% of purchases at IKEA are unplanned. So talk about impulse buying. But even those impulses are based on, as you say, years of cause and effect, observations, deep-seated beliefs and kind of perspectives and values. It's also kind of, in the moment decisions based on thousands of other cause effect observations that your brain has made. That's a flower vase. I like flowers. And oh, by the way, that's cheap enough that even if I don't love it in my house, it's not a big deal, right? Like, those are all beliefs. And they feel to us in the moment like facts, but they're not, right? They are facts to us based on the reality and the experience that we have. And it's our own interpretations that we are making in that moment. And so that's why I say in the new book, that yes, every decision has a story, but much more accurately, every action ends an internal argument, and one that you are not aware of, about why that action makes sense. And you know that because as soon as somebody says, well, why did you buy it? And you said, well, because I want it. And I'm like, okay, well, why did you want it? I need it. Do you? Probably not. But again, that's as much as your critical brain can come up with. And eventually it will come up with some kind of rationalization. But what was actually going on is a much deeper kind of, and before we could even be conscious of it, analysis of like, how have I behaved before? What are all these contextual issues I need to come into play? And fundamentally, the brain is going, if then because, and you're not even aware of it. And so those impulses, 100% agree. They're never impulsive. They always make sense. We're just not always aware of the lines of code that we've been following to get us there. But it's just as automatic and just as quick as a computer operating on its code.
Yeah, I can't help but think that, I mean, again, we hear so much about, and I think I've heard this a little bit debunked about how there's like, hey, you only use such and such amount of your brain. And it's like, yeah, but that's not all that it's cracked up to be. That's very much a movie or TV kind of, fact that's been thrown around.
Oversimplified.
Oversimplified. But I do believe there's still a lot more going on in our heads than we are fully aware of. There's a deep depth of ocean where it's speeding through flowcharts at speeds and about things we don't even know is happening.
And we actually know way more than we know. So one of the TEDx New England speakers I'm working with right now, this is part of her area of study. And it's this, in neuroscience, cognition, psychology, this is one of those places that unusually everybody kind of agrees on what to call it. And it's known as tacit or implicit knowledge. It's the stuff that you know, but you don't realize you know. One of the great examples that she gives, she basically says, how many windows are in your house? That is not an answer you have off the top of your head, but you do actually know the answer. Because if you stop and think, you probably think about the front of your house and you're like, or if you're in an apartment like I'm like, there's one there, there's one there, there's one there, and they're like, but what that's doing is it's changing the format of the information to bring it into a place where you can access it. And oh, yes, this is why it's just so deeply fascinating about how much is there. And I've recently been, one of my latest areas of research is the work of Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen. Argyris is no longer with us. He's at Harvard, I believe. But they developed a whole field, what they called action science, which is the science of how people turn intention to action. Like, what are all the mechanisms going on? Oh, so exciting. Yeah. And one of the things that they found in their work, and this is well supported, is that they have this thing called Model 1 thinking. And what they mean by Model 1 thinking is that it goes back to those means ends things, that you basically say, all right, if I'm trying to get these ends, then I'm operating on this kind of endless loop of try these means, get those ends, try these means, get those ends, and that there are tacit rules that we are following all the time in that Model 1 thinking. Things like don't let anybody else lose face, minimize conflict, things like that. And the studies that they did are so fascinating because they will tell people you are held prisoner by these beliefs. And people will be like, no. And they will give them examples of like somebody giving feedback and they'll be like, oh, here's all the reasons why that was wrong. And then what will happen is that they will put the people in the exact same situation and they will do exactly the same thing that they criticize the people in the case for. And people are like, what? How is that actually happening? And so you are right. I mean, just understanding that, I don't know them off the top of my head, but anyone can go look up Model 1 Thinking by Argyris and Schoen, 1982, I think, or maybe 74. But what is so interesting to me about this is that we spend so much time talking to the part of the brain that does the least amount of work. And that's this one. We spend all our time talking to this brain. Well, this one's slow and it gets tired and it gets super frustrated with people. And there's a limit to what it can process. I think one of the best metaphors that people are familiar with about kind of the relationship between these two processing systems of the brain, the kind of like slow, critical, what's known as system 2, and the fast, intuitive, often emotional, instinctive, shortcut following system 1 brain. The Heath brothers talked about it in terms of the elephant and the rider and the path, right? And where the elephant, the big one, the big heavy one, is that fast, intuitive brain. And so you've got this little tiny human at the top of this, like attempting to guide the elephant. But the thing is that elephant decides that it wants to go someplace else. That elephant is going to go someplace else. And it's such an important reminder that what we are consciously aware of as how we think and how we communicate, how we make decisions, how we buy, how we sell, how we persuade, how we respond to people is that little tiny human. So much of it is actually that elephant. And, we've got to feed the elephant first. Is my point. Like the elephant has to be happy or else that little person on top is not going to be happy. So it's really, the more that you start to pay attention to things like and ask when you ask somebody why or what makes you, believe so strongly in that, and then they give you evidence, and then you either ask them or you start to figure out for yourself, like what must be true for them, for that evidence to support, because the evidence on its own doesn't. So anyway, feed the elephants first.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that's coming to mind here is just the amount of depth that you could do, not just in externalizing and trying to, you said not to use the word persuade. What was the other one? You prefer a different one. I forget what it was.
I know what to call it.
But let's just say communicate.
It's genuine belief. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's, typically I will frame it from the established term as kind of collective action, right? Like, or collective agreement or collaborative reasoning, right? Like what we're trying to get to is everybody kind of agreeing that this is the right thing, not because they've been manipulated into it, but because they have it's a fully informed, free, and open choice.
Yeah. I think where I'm going with this is you're making me think there's a lot of homework someone could do just internally, drilling down and saying, okay, well, I did this, but why did I did this? And then, talking with your own subconscious, or the man and the elephant talking to each other, basically.
That's right. Like by having some kind of decoder ring to do that. And that's why I'm such a believer in these externalized, explicit mental models, or using these models that are proxy for how we think about things. Because if you fill out the red thread, or if you fill out my kind of companion agreement explicit model, which is I call the core case, you end up doing that. But there's also good priors for that kind of having deep conversations with yourself. So, there's great work by Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy, I think, called Immunity to Change. And there's they have kind of immunity to change model, which is doing very much a very similar thing. They're not using argumentation and reasoning as a way, but they are getting the reasoning out, which is, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? What are you doing that's not accomplishing that? Why are you doing those things? What must you believe? What assumptions must you have in order for you to be protecting those, what they call hidden commitments, so deeply that you are actually working against your own desires? Therapy, like cognitive behavior therapy, is all about that too, right? It's about surfacing those silent assumptions. So, it's why that kind of elephant and rider metaphor can be so useful. It's because we are not helpless against our system one. We're not helpless against the elephant. And actually, I've recently been saying my preferred model, I think that the elephant, we should replace it with a team of sled dogs, because the elephant makes it feel like we're monolithic and it's always this big set of things that's coming into play, and it's not. It's kind of contextually, we're pulling certain beliefs are being pulled in given what our behaviors have been in the past, right? So we've got this team of sled dogs that we may swap out different dogs, or we may put different dogs in the lead. And I think that helps to articulate even more strongly, not only what can be the challenge, but also where the opportunity is. Because, we've kind of touched on it from a couple different sides, but I think there is a fairly big band of common ground beliefs. Of, the easiest ones to point to are the basic axioms of science and math, of things like, to get to zero, every negative needs a positive, right? Or a body in motion stays in motion, and, unless acted on by an external force. These are as close to truth, even for scientists, as we can get. And there's a lot of things like that. And it's not just math and science. And so the reason why I think that's so important, why I do this work, why I'm working so hard to figure out a way to help make it even easier and even faster to surface these kind of, our strongest sled dogs, is that because when we can say, you know what, kind of back in your training camp, you've actually got a couple dogs that are going to get you a lot closer to where you're trying to go. And I know, because I've used those dogs too, that ends up making even the newest, most unfamiliar approach, the newest, most unfamiliar ideas, the most novel, potentially disruptive strategies feel familiar and feel therefore less risky. And ultimately, when it comes to making things make sense, is that what we're really assessing in that moment is, does the amount of risk I'm about to take on here make sense in light of everything else that I'm experiencing at the moment? And so that's really what the job of any form of communication around change is about. And, while you made a comment that I've broadened my work recently. My first job out of grad school was a change management consultant. So I don't feel like I've ever stopped thinking about communications that create change. And really, ultimately, it is about de-risking that change. A lot of times people are like, people hate change. I'm like, no. They actually hate risky change. They hate risky change. We're really good about change. Change aversion is risk aversion. So if you're trying to get out of that loop, you've got to figure out, what is it about this change that somebody really feels is most at risk? And that's what you have to find ways to make them comfortable. Again, not in a manipulative way, but in a way that legitimately helps them feel comfortable.
This feels like the beginning of like a master class in message design and human behavior. I know if people want to go deeper, though, into your world, Red Thread Labs, workshops, the new book, what's the next best step?
I'd say to go to messagedesigninstitute.com and to sign up for that newsletter. So it's really easy. It's right there on the front, but the newsletter is where I'm playing with new ideas first. That's where I'm kind of testing out and presenting things for the first time to folks, but it's also where we announce things like the monthly free webinars and kind of the more dedicated live trainings to help people really dig into this on their own.
Awesome. Tamsen, great talking with you. I consider this the first of many future appearances. So thank you so much for sharing and dropping all this knowledge on us.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Great to see you, Eric.
You too. Well, that's another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. I hope that you enjoyed listening in on this conversation with Tamsen about the red thread, as well as saying what they can't unhear and the 9 principles of lasting change. Honestly, both these books are kind of critical when it comes to communicating and navigating communication in the workplace, as well as creating content. I know I don't love saying the words content. It means less to me than art or using your creative gifts, but it is what it is. We are where we are in the world in terms of what that word content means for a lot of people. It's the stuff you make, I guess. But all that said, that doesn't mean that if the word isn't that great of a word, that the things that you're making can't be artful. And again, both these books are huge tools in the toolkit for doing great work. So I hope that you got a lot out of this. I know that if you have not read either book, both are great to pick up. You'll find the link to those in the show notes. And if you found this episode helpful, I would love for you to do me the favor and Tamsen the favor of sharing this episode with somebody that you know needs to hear it. Hit that share button in your podcast player app of choice, wherever you're listening to this. Share it on over to somebody you know. Let them know you were thinking of them. Persuade them. Use some of what you heard in this conversation to persuade them to listen to this episode. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next episode.